Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Charles Eisenstein. So Charles is a really interesting guy working a lot with the body in relationship to the environment. And his work is profound. I've been into it for a couple of years myself, and it really goes across quite broad areas. So the environmental piece Charles is known for, but he also looks at economy and money and masculinity. And I personally did a course of his on food. And maybe he's going to tell us how some of these things link together. But Charles, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
So how did you get interested in the body? What was your relationship to that growing up as our sort of normal way in for this audience?
Oh gosh, I I think I'm probably just about the last person who'd be associated with embodiment. But it's interesting that you ask. You know, I was when I was in school, I was super nerdy, very mental, very intellectual. Did very well in elementary school, was a top student. And then in junior high school, that's what we called it back then, 7th grade, 8th grade, I developed more slowly than everybody else. Everybody else hit puberty first. And I was young already, like I was one of the youngest kids in my grade. So I ended up being 2 years behind everybody else, basically. And suffered a lot of bullying and became, I guess, I internalized a lot of that and had this strong rejection of the mind. I didn't want people to think I was the smart kid, the brain. They called them the brains. In our school, there were 3 classes. There were the brains, the hicks, and the jocks. The hicks being like the rural kids.
Got it.
The jocks being the athletic kids, and then the brains, being the brainy kids. And I sure as hell didn't want to be a brain. I wanted to be popular.
Right. I remember at school we had sets, they called them in our school, and that was the way they divided the children. They said we had 4 sets, and if you were in the top set, you were like a brain, and that wasn't necessarily cool, but it was in another way seen as superior. I think this is quite an interesting parallel with some of your work. Like you were on top, you were the first set. And on the one hand, it was like geeky and embarrassing. And on the other hand, it was like this slight superiority of the less intellectual children who may have had other talents.
Right. Yeah. But this wasn't coming from the school authorities at all.
Okay.
This was just the way that the kids categorized themselves. So anyway, I pretty much repudiated my intellect for quite a few years and went out for sports, ran track and cross country and developed my body in this very almost brutal fashion. Like the sports, track and cross country. I mean, this was running, this was a very pure physical expression, no nuance really in it. It's just training your endurance and strength, like full on. It was, I, in a way, like I'm a embodiment moron. Like I'm, never became like a dancer, or for me, it was just all about the most crude level of embodiment. Mm-hmm. So, that's my history. So I'm definitely not the kind of person that, I don't know, I wouldn't call myself an embodiment expert of any kind.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I might challenge you a bit on that. I mean, certainly in terms of your work, and often people who get very interested in the body, I've, done 150 plus of these interviews now, they often either are hyper intellectual, which is my own story actually, or they're injured in some way. They have some trauma or physical injury. They have some disconnect from the body. And I think the naturals, as it were, the people who are just naturally maybe in their bodies a lot more, don't ever get interested in embodiment as a line of work. So it is, I was thinking, like, what do I write about you on the, normally I say, today, dancer, such and such, today, yoga teacher, such and such. Philip Shepherd, even, I think I described him as environmental embodiment teacher. Whereas with you, your work goes across so many disciplines. When you meet people at parties, because it's a crazy party scene I imagine you're in, but when you meet people at parties, Charles, like, what do you describe yourself as, just like work-wise?
Yeah. Well, so in those situations where I can't avoid being at a party and I'm asked that, I basically say I'm serving the transition in our deep stories, in the deep narratives and myths that run our civilization. So one of those is that the mind is much more important than the body.
Yeah.
Like, that's one of the deep narratives that I think needs to change. And we need to re-embrace physicality, re-embrace materiality, because so much of the destruction on this planet is happening because we do not hold materiality sacred. It's not that we are too materialistic. It's that we're not materialistic enough, right, in the sense of making matter into something less than what it is. And part of that is making the body into something less than what it is, making the body into the mere vehicle of the soul or the mere container of a spirit. Just a bunch of stuff, And the important part is the part that isn't the body, the consciousness, the mind, the spirit. That is garbage, I think. Or let's say it's a paradigm that really, really needs to change right now. So ironically, like on an intellectual level, I'm very into embodiment. But if you see me on the dance floor, you might be like, oh, this guy needs to do a little bit of work on embodiment.
And actually, for me, there's this distinction between embodiment and athleticism, right? Like, someone doesn't have to be a great dancer. Actually, I'm experiencing you now as very present as a guest, very in the moment. There's a kind of quality of realness there, which sometimes guests come and they're just in their head and they kind of talk at me. And, like, for me, that's a more important quality of embodiment than whether you can, do the twist well. So again, I'm going to keep pushing back by whether you're an embodiment teacher or not here. And I guess what your work and, my work and many guests' work shares is this idea of reconnection. So I've heard you previously talk about a story of disconnection. That for me feels like the very heart of embodiment, connecting to ourselves, connecting to community, and connecting to the wider world. Yeah,
in a way, you could say it's just to rejoin this world that our culture, our civilization has abstracted us from. Removed us from, replaced physical, tangible, emotional connections with electronically mediated and financially mediated connections. So to something as simple as to be in physical contact with the soil that grows our food, or with the people that grow our food. Ordinarily in my society, there's probably 5 or 6 or 10 intermediaries between the actual farmer who grew the food and myself, ordinarily. If I go to farmers markets, then maybe there's just one intermediary, but less than 1% of food is bought at farmers markets.
I had this experience last night. I flew in from Israel last night, and I was on a flight full of sort of slightly traumatized Israeli people. The whole flight kind of felt a bit stiff and disconnected in my body. I got to the airport. I'm processed kind of like, we'd say, like cattle, which I think says something, with the machines that you put your passport in, you don't even have to talk to the guy anymore. I got on a train. I bought the ticket from a machine. I got on the train and I had 5 minutes and I was like, I haven't eaten in like 8 hours. I need to eat. I grabbed something and I grabbed like it's like a hot slice, they call it. So it's really crappy processed food. And I'm at a plastic table on a train, surrounded by strangers. And I was just really aware of how unsatisfying that meal was. Now, like, it may have had enough protein, it may have had enough fats or whatever, carbohydrates, and it was enough to fill my belly. But I was just tremendously aware of how disconnected from the food, from the people around me, from this weird plastic metal environment I was in. And it just was deeply unsatisfying as a meal. And I remember thinking, I'm talking to Charles tomorrow. This is interesting. This is funny, But is that kind of I'm giving this as an example of a sort of modern experience of disconnection, because I don't think that experience was so different than large chunks of most of people's lives.
Yeah, and then eventually that becomes normalized, and then that brings up what's the path back when we're immersed in an environment where that's pretty much almost all that is offered to us. Like that's what's on the menu, one processed option or another, and not just food. But, if you want to really be in intimate contact with soil and plants and animals, you have to pretty much depart from much of a modern lifestyle. Mm-hmm. My brother is a farmer, and he's grows organic vegetables, and like he's pretty much in contact with the earth, but he has removed himself in many ways from the matrix. And so this path back, I think one thing that you said hints at what the path back is. You noted how unsatisfying the meal was. And this desire for satisfaction, this desire for pleasure, processed food has a lot of loud flavors that trick you into thinking that you like it. But if you paid close attention, underneath that superficial sensory impact, you notice, as you did, that it's not actually very satisfying, that it doesn't actually taste that good. And this quest, and this is part of re-embodiment, to say, I want to feel good. I want to enjoy life for real, and reject the substitutes for authentic, satisfying experiences. So part of that would be, I want real food. I want to feel good in all my cells, not just in my mouth.
Not just from the head, right? Not just like, hey, I should be eating green smoothies because that's healthy for me. Like, right. One thing I took away from your food course is when I go to a restaurant now, I kind of just feel my body. I go, what do I actually feel like? Mm-hmm. Rather than what's the diet I'm imposing upon myself. And I notice how hungry I am, and I notice the food during and afterwards, and if it's really satisfying me or not. And that's a different relationship than imposing a diet because I'm supposed to eat vegetables or something.
Right. That would be imposing the mind over the body.
Right. So food's a good example, right? I feel like this is a great example that people can relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. Because otherwise, for 30, 40 years, they were telling us that saturated fat causes heart disease. That was the overwhelming scientific consensus. It was in government recommendations. It was in the school curriculums. I mean, it was in the hospitals everywhere. And after about 40 years of that, finally, they're like, oh, actually, that was wrong.
Yes.
So if you had been imposing your mind over your body for all those years, trying to eat according to the latest science, then you would have been depriving yourself of something that most people really need, saturated fats. But of course, now we know that, now we've corrected those mistakes, right? And so now, thanks to advances in science, we can trust what the scientists tell us about our bodies and continue not to listen to what is coming from within. But I'll just say one more thing there. This is a learned skill, or a relearned skill, to actually listen to the body. Because for many people, including myself, so many years and decades of training in denying the body made it hard for me to get back in touch with what I actually wanted.
Yes.
So the prescription, this is what I work with in that food course, the prescription of, well, just eat what you want. Trust the body, eat what you want. But do you know how to do that? And do you actually know what you want? How do you know what you want? You have to really listen. You have to really tune in. And that's, for many people, a new habit that requires some development.
Even for me as a embodiment practitioner, I remember almost like a fear came up for me. Like, God, if I eat what I want, then I'm going to get obese. I'm just going to, this idea of we need to have discipline, and that's been drummed into me on so many levels. And in the movement culture, it's drummed into people. You don't just move; you have to make the shape. You have to make the Iyengar prescribed triangle shape, or the straight lines that are drawn on the yoga book. It's a similar thing in movement circles, but it really came up for me almost like as a fear.
Yeah, right. It's a deep programming that the body is bad, and that your progress, your health, comes through overcoming the body. It's a kind of a conquest. Your discipline, your will overcomes the bestial impulses of the body. And
You'll see this in advertising, won't you, around like gym culture, diet culture. It's really, really very common to use this almost medieval flagellating, the battle against your appetite kind of thing.
yeah, it's the war against the self.
Yeah.
So it's the spirit at war with the flesh. And that is a mirror of the human war against nature.
Yep.
And that's the connection, or one connection, between embodiment and environmentalism.
So let's make that a bit explicit, because that makes sense to me. We've had a few speakers on the podcast who've talked about this, but let's make that explicit. So this idea that your relationship to yourself, your body particularly, is a mirror, a metaphor for a recreation of, a microcosm of our relationship to the planet. So if the basic relationship is mind is in charge, you have to subjugate, you have to control. It's always dangerous. It could rise up at any point. And then this then becomes a relationship to how we see the natural world.
Yeah, it's part of the same thinking, the same mentality of domination. And on the one hand, turned inwards, domination over the self, and on the other hand, turned outwards, domination of nature. So it's part of the same way of thinking. And the alternative, I guess, in parallel to trusting and listening to the body and saying, what do you want? What do I want? We could do the same with the world outside of ourselves and ask, well, what do you want, world? What do you want, soil? What do you want, forest? That is an unfamiliar question to the dominant culture of this world, because just as conventional medicine typically sees the body as the generator of problems and and an object to be controlled, and lacking in intelligence and a movement to healing, so also do we see nature as not having intelligence, and therefore we need to impose intelligence, make improvements on it. And why not just extract from it if it's not a being that we could ask, well, what do you want?
It's an object, not a subject. Yeah. It's a resource. Definition of embodiment is the subjective view of the body.
Right.
Depth ecology would be the subjective view of the planet. The body is not just a resource to be used up in the same way as the body isn't just a resource to be used up or controlled.
Yeah.
I guess that you must get pushback, kind of like play devil's advocate a bit here, like Charles, like this is a sort of liberal pipe dream. It's all very nice, but we need discipline. We need to discipline our children, ourselves, and it all sounds like a sort of fluffy, nice dream what you're talking about. And I hear that voice in myself when I read your stuff. Part of me goes, this is too good to be true, or I don't quite believe it. I don't quite trust enough.
Well, it's not that I'm not saying that we just step back and let nature take its course. It's that we see ourselves as participants. So a good example would be permaculture, maybe, or regenerative agriculture, where we listen to that. We follow that question: what does the soil want, and how can I provide it, and what is the gift that I'm meant to give here? With parenting, it's something similar. It's what is the potential of this child? What does this child want to become, maybe even on an unconscious level? And how do I contribute to that becoming? How do I participate in that? I find, and there is some fear there, like, what if I don't make my kid say please and thank you and apologize when he hurts somebody? That is necessary if you don't really trust that the healthy, whole human being wants to be generous, wants to be kind, has empathy, feels bad if he hurts somebody. But I can say, and I'm not claiming to have fully embodied this in my practice as a parent, but I noticed recently on a trip that my son, like, I never told him to say thank you, because I thought that's teaching insincerity. He's not feeling thankful, but I tell him to say thank you. If he's not feeling sorry, but I tell him to apologize, I'm training him in insincerity. So I've been really careful not to do that. And I noticed, this was my 13-year-old. He was 13 at the time, he's 14 now. I just noticed how consistently polite he was, how he said thank you, said please, was courteous, looking people in the eyes, he did so, and how impressed people were with that, compared to someone who kind of casts their eyes down and says, "Thank you. What do you say? Thank you."
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
you hear the resentment in that,
Yeah.
So I think, the sphere that you're speaking of, I know what you're talking about. And, it's like in agriculture, like, well, if we don't spray, then the insects are going to come and eat the crops. It's the same kind of fear that says better be in control more.
Mm.
And I guess I can't say that I can prove that this fear is unfounded. All I can say is there's a part of you that feels daring and wants to make that release, wants to let go and trust and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Someone once said that the fundamental difference between liberals and conservatives was a difference in fundamental goodness versus original sin. Mm-hmm. The idea that you could trust that there is a fundamental goodness there to your, we've talked about eating or, children going to bed or whatever, being polite, whatever it is, the relationship to the planet. And sometimes there's something that feels slightly like lopsided in your work to me. Like it leans towards the liberal truth, which I actually really do buy as very beautiful and very true. And I'm like, I have a concern there's a sort of a complementary truth which is left out. Does that make sense? It's kind of intuitive. Like I read your work and I enjoy it and I go, that's so true and beautifully articulated. And this is really practical actually, like with the food, really changed my relationship to that. And then there's another part of me that goes, maybe there's another truth that's being missed out here somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And can you maybe articulate that other truth in as pure form as you can?
I'm not sure I can. It's something like the role of discipline or the role of an embodiment. There's freedom and form, right? So there's the role of, in Japanese martial arts, for example, there's a form and a structure and a practice and a beauty in some ways, even to imposing something. And then there's the sort of feeling into in the free form and the spontaneous and the authentic. Mm-hmm. And there's a holding of both of these as valuable.
Yeah. I thought quite a bit about discipline and willpower and what their purpose is in this worldview that I'm describing, because I don't think that these are bad things either. They have their purpose. And if it's not a world based on control, then what is their purpose? And also looking in nature, it's not that animals don't exert some kind of force, some kind of like domination exists in nature too. Mm-hmm. Animals, they create a territory for themselves. They prey on each other. They deceive each other. There's definitely competition in the world and a necessity to maintain a boundary. And then, so what I came to is that for me, discipline is a kind of a holding of an alignment to something that I want to create or something that I want to be in service to. So if I hold that strongly, so for example, okay, I'll give you a real current example for me. I just went on another news fast. I do these periodically. Mm-hmm. When I notice that, like I have a reason why I'm going to read the news, why I'm going to go to this site or that site, because I need to keep informed, because it feeds into my work, et cetera, et cetera. But actually in that moment, it's this kind of slackness, it's this kind of passivity. And I end up going from one to another. And it's like I've lost my volition. I'm being seized by some other power. And even if I only spent maybe an hour doing that, that's 1 hour lost for doing something that might be more aligned with who I want to be, what I want to serve. But also that hour of slackness kind of infects the rest of my day in a way. So I'm on a news fast now where I just don't look at any of those sites. And you might say that that's a kind of a discipline, but it's not just that this is a bad habit and I'm going to conquer it. It's sourced in what do I want to be and what am I serving? And the more, like, imagine if, I don't know, do you have children or?
I'm around children quite a bit, but none of mine.
Okay, so suppose you're around there's a child that you love and that child's missing, lost. He was there 10 minutes ago, now he's not anywhere. Like, you are not going to be playing a game of Tetris maybe I'll check the news first. Yeah, let's play a game of Tetris first. Let's do something. No, like you are going to put everything you have into finding that child right now.
Yeah.
Because you are absolutely aligned with that. So your discipline in that situation, finger quotes here, your discipline in that situation is a byproduct of a total alignment to an aim, to a mission, to an objective.
Discipline is remembering what you love is a phrase I like. Staying connected to values, what you really care about. You know, sometimes people say, how do you have the discipline to get up and meditate? I'm like, I love meditating. What do you?
Right.
It's not necessarily required most of the time anyway.
Right. So, and I don't know, does that answer your question?
It's something that's just been there as a kind of feeling for me, or like an itch for a while, and I wanted to bring it to you. How does this stuff apply to relationships then? Or like we talked about food, we talked about maybe the relationships to the planet, but this is other disconnection to each other, right? Like real, authentic human relationships are one of the casualties of this mental disconnection.
Mm-hmm. How does what apply to it exactly?
The story of disconnection, this story of control. Like, if I'm I guess it's like I need to control other people. Like I started something recently called Embodiment Circles, and it was almost like a leap of faith to not try and control all these different groups around the world. Mm-hmm. And I went for an option of saying, we're not going to try and impose any rules. We're just going to go for connection and sharing and, share experience. But there was a leap of faith in that, but it enabled that I wasn't in that relationship of trying to control people, which is impossible anyway, right? Which seems to be the sort of King Canutian kind of task. It's very easy to fall in human relations. How can I get this person to do what I want, as opposed to how can I be connected to this person and respect them as a subject?
Yeah. For me, the biggest breakthrough that I have in applying the idea of interbeing, that's the word I like to use for the story we're moving into, to relationships is to understand that this person in front of me is a complete subject unto themselves, an entire universe having a subjective experience. And you'd think that would be like a kindergarten level realization, that this is a person too, just as much as I am, having they're sentient, they're perceiving, they're a being just like me, with the entirety of that. You're looking at me through a whole other set of eyes, and you're having an experience. You're a consciousness too. That goes against a lot of the cultural programming that has us see each other as either threats or competitors or somebody to take advantage of, economic targets in a way, or sex objects or something. The programming, if you're a separate self, then your natural relationship with another is to try to get something for your separate self, which could be at their expense. And in order to do that, we objectify each other. So it's about undoing objectification. And yeah, intellectually, sure, I know that you are just as much of a being as I am, but to really get that, and this is powerful work if you're in some kind of circle, or in some kind of one-on-one situation, and you just say, okay, we're going to look at each other and fully understand that this is an entire subject looking back at me. That is really powerful. And I think that from that place, from that realization, all of the domination, exploitation, objectification of each other becomes impossible. It just feels really false once we go to that place. And therefore, anytime that we can insinuate that perception in another person of seeing others as full beings, we're really creating some change in the world.
Yeah. And I think maybe it's easy to say, oh, that's just something psychopaths do, or sex offenders or something like that, but I notice myself doing this moment by moment all the time with people. Just like I'm interviewing you and it's like, what can I get from Charles? Let's get him to say something clever for the audience, or like the audience, like there's people listening to this podcast, and, I can be listening to a podcast, like, what can I take here? Not really realizing this is actually two human beings giving their time to have a conversation, like wanting to connect. to explore, and they can listen to that podcast like a consumer. And I noticed with the embodiment circles, these groups, people getting together to share with each other, that people would have a habit of going into a consumer mindset. Mm-hmm. Like, what can I take? Or it might be like, what can I, it's a donation based thing, which I know you work with as well. It'd be nice to hear you talk a little bit about economics. And sometimes it's easy to like, what's the minimum I can get away with giving can become the mindset, you know, as opposed to another way. Like, we're trained to think that way economically, right? There's a word in Hebrew for basically like a sucker. And it's a really big concept in Israel. Like, don't be a sucker. Don't pay more than necessary.
Right.
And, like, that's another way we're indoctrinated, right? Is economically.
Yeah. It's built into our economy. It's built into economics. The study of economics also, page 1 of your economics textbook says that human beings are fundamentally motivated to maximize their rational self-interest. That's the premise on which it's built. And we live in a world where that very often seems true, where someone's trying to get something from you. They're trying to maximize their interest. You're trying to maximize your interest. You strike a deal. And the deal is enforced by the state. That's essentially how it is. And even if you like to think of yourself as somebody who really cares about other people, immersed in this economy, like, you go online to buy an airplane ticket, and there's typically, if you're like me, you'll compare for this route. You know, United Airlines offers this price, and whatever airlines offers that price. Which one are you going to choose? Are you going to think, well, maybe I better pay the more expensive one, because then they'll be able to pay their employees better, and they'll be able to make a nice profit and enjoy life more, so I'll pay more. That's not normal economic logic. So you and I are part of the same game too. So no wonder we see other people as wanting to take advantage of us, as wanting to get the best deal. It's ubiquitous. So yeah, like the Israeli saying that you just mentioned, don't be a sucker, don't be a chump, you know, it's a symptom of the world that we've constructed for ourselves. And
as you say, that's the default. If you've ever done, you work with this gift economy, and it takes people a little while to, and I've noticed myself, like, what is everyone else paying? And, there's like a whole process people can go through, and you do, all your courses are by donation, right? Online. This is quite radical for a relatively well-known speaker, teacher in this field. Like, say something about that personal decision to make your courses by donation. And when you did the conference, you said, hey, I want to make sure my stuff isn't behind a firewall. You insisted upon that. We honored that. And that, I think you're one of 140 teachers that said that. So it's like, you're the only one. So it's like, say something about your personal decision to make your courses donation-based.
Well, for one thing, ironically, it's not because I don't think that they're very valuable. Like some people say, oh, you're not valuing yourself. You should make people pay to signal to yourself that this is valuable, to really embrace your value. And I'm like, no, it's because I so believe in its value that I don't want to hold it back from somebody who might need it and doesn't have the money to pay for it. I'm not doing this for the money, fundamentally. I mean, sure, I like money. I can do beautiful things with money. I can raise my children. I can support other people in my sphere. Like, I like money, but it's not like I decided, okay, here I'm going to do this for the money. It's because I think that it's really important that this information gets out in the world. So I'm not going to hold it back and put the money first and say, I'm only going to give it to you if you pay me.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's one thing. And then also, we live in a very unequal world. And some people, whether because of their birth privilege or their talent, their intelligence, their luck, their karma, their destiny, whatever, some people have a lot more money than others. And some people have other skills, not money, but some other gift. And in order for us to come together and birth the future that is asking to be born, that wants to be born for humanity, everybody's gifts have to come together. So I like to create an opportunity for those who do have the money to give that, maybe as much or maybe even more than they ordinarily would for an online course or an online program. So I am open to receiving that.
My experience when I did things by donation, and I still sometimes do, the circles, for example, is all donation, is people give generally will give a bit less than if it was a thing that the way where they were forced to buy.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty, there's a few that aren't. Like I've got a Buddhist friend and I know he's really going to feel into it and be generous, and it's a real practice for him. Right. But it's almost like a lot of people that, and sometimes myself included, guys, I pay £10, I'm going to just give 8, yeah. They're sort of cutting 20% off what they would normally give. And that feels like almost taking advantage of that generosity.
Yeah, that happens. That can be remedied to some extent by how the language you create around it. But you're right. People have these habits that are the result of having been in a competitive, exploitative, unfair economy. Habits of self-protection. Habits of, I'm not going to be the chump. I'm not going to be so you have to create some kind of invitation for people to step out of those habits and into a different way of seeing themselves and each other and the world. And that can be done in part through the language you use around it, but that language won't work if it's not coming from a genuine place. Really what you have to do is learn to see other people as, I know you want to give. I know that you are generous. I know that the reason you're here in the world is to give to something beyond yourself, that you are in service to life, or you want to be in service to life, and to be able to see that not as an ideology, but to actually see it in other people. Then you can create an effective invitation. And if you want to know whether you're sincere or not, you can know, because if someone doesn't give anything, even though you know that they're wealthy, you don't feel a shred of resentment or judgment.
Wow. Okay. That's the test, right? The litmus test.
Genuine welcome. It's a genuine welcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And people will feel that if you're not their enemy.
Uh-huh.
You're not in judgment of them.
Nice. Well, it's obviously working out. I mean, you're still in business, right? Just paying the rent, and
yeah, it ebbs and flows.
Slightly weird world we're in.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at masculinity a little bit then, because I know it seems like we're jumping around here, but it's actually your work is a thread that goes through all these subjects. I haven't seen your work on this, and I understand you had another course on masculinity. So how did that come up as a topic?
This theme that I work with of the disintegration of our old stories and the birth of new stories, specifically the stories that tell us who we are and what's real and what's important and how to be human. For example, how to be a man, how to be a woman. These stories, the ones that we inherited, they don't satisfy us. They don't offer a formula or an identity that is who we want to be right now. And so the story of masculinity, here's what it is to be a man. Here's how to do man. The one that we inherited from previous generations, that isn't quite right. And so does that mean that we abandon masculinity as some kind of pathological binary and enter a totally gender fluid society, or embrace our inner feminine and retreat from masculinity because look how bad it is? I came to reject that, although I did consider that as one of the options on the table. But what I came to is, no, what we need is a new story of masculinity, a new story of what it is to be a man that we can live into, a story that is right for our time, that is not part of patriarchal domination of women, of matter, of each other, but that is nonetheless recognizable as masculine on some deep level that appeals to me, not just as a human, but as a man.
Okay, so we may disagree here on a few things. I'm a fairly big fan of sort of traditional masculine stories and narratives. I think the first thing is to get clear on what they are, though, right? like for me, there's like maybe they need an update, or they need a kind of 2019 version. I'm not sure there's I mean, let's start with what you see as those stories. Then is it like, for example,
one of the stories of masculinity that does not resonate for me is that a man never cries. A man doesn't really feel his emotions.
I'd say that's a misreading. I'd say the story there is a man has resilient and is able to self-regulate. For me, the traditional masculine does involve feeling and may involve crying, but it doesn't involve being a mess.
Well, the story that I grew up in and was enforced by my peers in high school was definitely that it is unmanly to cry and to feel too much. So for me, a new story of masculinity is actually kind of what you were saying, that it has to do with resiliency. It has to do with patience. It has to do with mastery. It has to do with alignment to a purpose. And yeah, so that would be an example of what I'm talking about. So basically, I ended up with a very non-PC understanding that there is something essential about masculinity. It is not just a cultural construct, not something to be vilified, not something to be condemned, but something to be rediscovered and embraced. And like these certain masculine qualities that have been damaging in the world have a purpose when they're in service to life. They're not bad, like linearity, focus, abstraction. These are to many people recognizably masculine traits. Kind of like assertiveness, Are these bad because they've caused so much destruction in the world? Or is it that they've just become unhinged, disconnected from their purpose, which is in service to life? So that's I don't think that we're really in disagreement here.
Yeah, so for me, there's like a sense of okay, there's traditional masculine values, if you will, and people want to either say they're totally socially constructed, and I think, it sounds like you've come to the conclusion that's not the case, or that they're totally pathological, and we need to, let the feminine be in charge 100%, just, throw the baby out with the bathwater, maybe, swing to another pole. And another pole is like, okay, maybe there's something here that there's a naturalness to, B, there's a desirability at a sophisticated level. So the don't cry, don't feel becomes be emotionally resilient, be able to self-regulate, know when to express and when not to express, because both of those two things have a place. Like if I'm giving a eulogy at my father's funeral, I might actually want to cry after that and not fall apart in the middle of it, because I want to be of service to my family and my sister and to him at that moment, right? So actually maybe don't cry is actually the exact right thing for the next 10 minutes. And then I let go of that afterwards, right? So I'm taking on a traditional masculine value, and quite literally in this case, but I'm working at a slightly more sophisticated way with that, in service to something bigger than just repressing my feelings.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the online course was an exploration of that. And I recorded conversations with mostly men who are doing various kinds of men's work. And I learned a lot from it. And I don't have all the answers yet.
Did you get some fun pushback, Charles? Did you? Because it's a fairly un-PC position, as you say, that you took there.
I have to say, not a lot of pushback. There were probably close to half the people enrolled in the course were women. And they resonated very much with it as well. Because there's also, I guess you could make a course on femininity too. And anyway, I could talk a lot more about this whole thing if you want me to. But
I'm curious, because it is a very hot topic right now, and it's a very delicate topic. And there's a way that I see that you bring truth to things without being provocative or ruffling people the wrong way, in a way that's not useful. And it feels like that's kind of what's needed right now. I don't have, particularly my personality type doesn't really have the skill set for what's needed right now. And it strikes me that there's a very delicate conversation that really needs to be had right now.
I mean, one thing that underlies the conversation, and that is not something you can touch with intellect or even conversation, is that there is a lot of rage out there. And the rage is well-founded. I mean, women have been disrespected and abused for centuries. And that is, in my view, not because that's just who men are to do that, but it's because our culture has lost touch with what the masculine is supposed to do and supposed to be. So in order for the conversation to proceed, sometimes I think like this rage just has to be let out. And one exploration I've done is, what is a masculine response to feminine rage? So the three ways, I thought, okay, there's three ways that a man can wuss out and not stand in his masculinity faced with feminine rage. One would be to lash out because you just can't take it.
Right. Yeah.
So to strike back, to get mad yourself.
Yeah.
And not be able to hold it.
Yeah.
All right. Second way is to capitulate.
Right.
Into abasing yourself.
Apologetic. Yeah.
Right. Getting all apologetic, which is actually submissiveness.
Yes.
Okay. The third way to wuss out is to go numb.
Okay. So it's for fight, flight, freeze kind of thing, right? Just
yeah.
Check it. So one would be like, fuck you, what about men? And what are all the ways men have suffered too? And which is, in some ways valid, but it's also like a pushback.
Men have suffered too, but like you're saying, that's not the moment.
Right. Now's the moment. Yeah, maybe. And then the second one is, as you say, like I'm so sorry, this sort of tail between your legs, penis between your legs, kind of overly apologetic. And in my experience, that actually just creates, like, both of those actually lead to more rage.
Yeah.
Like neither of those is actually one. And the third way is a sort of numbing, just sort of not feeling it. Because it's hard, man. Like if I'm sitting with a female friend who is telling me about a rape that happened to her some years ago, and I'm listening, and it's like, fuck. It's really hard to sit there and feel, while I'm going to care about this person, she's telling me this story like in detail, and I'm like, whew. And I'm pretty resourced to hear those stories compared to maybe the average guy who hasn't got any therapeutic training, embodiment training, hasn't worked in places I've worked, and that was a tough 20 minutes for me.
Yeah, and imagine how tough it is. Like, she wasn't maybe blaming you, but imagine if she was, blaming you too, just as a representative of the male sex,
as a man.
And so to hold that, because really what's needed for healing is for these stories to be heard, like really heard. Yeah, for the rage to be heard. Yeah, and I feel you. I feel where you are. I'm with you there. To me, that is, if I'm talking about a high expression of masculinity, and maybe it's just humanity and not masculinity, but for me, there's a certain sense of like really standing firm and being present, like intense presence.
Unflappability is a traditional masculine quality. You'll see it in every James Bond film. It's in unsophisticated ways. This is just the emotionally intelligent version of that you're talking about.
Presence, maybe you could call it.
Yeah.
To be really, really present. So that's a masculine trait that I've been aspiring to, and because really, and it's also related to alignment to a mission or a purpose. Because what do I really want in this interaction with an angry, hurt woman? Do I want to get off the hook? Is that what my goal in life is? To get off the hook, to not be receiving that anger, or is what I want actual healing in the world? What I want to have respectful relations between the genders, is, what do I want? And then this goes back to indigenous perspectives on masculinity that I came across in this research too, that the men they maintain the perimeter, they keep the tribe safe, they do the stuff that requires journeying away from home and family. They provide meat for the tribe. They go out and they come back with gifts. So they protect and extend out into the world, and in service to life, specifically in service to the as Pat McCabe calls them, the life bringers, life bearers, the women, the children, who are the future of life. So to connect back to that mission of service, to me, it informs who I want to be when I'm facing, it could be feminine rage, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, racial rage, the expression of centuries of injustice toward Black people, or whatever built up trauma is ready to be released. In service to life, I want to be able to be present to that so that it can be released without generating either, my fighting it and creating more trauma, or running away from it, as you said, flight, or just like going numb to it. It's time to face the shit, and not wuss out on it.
Yeah, I like the perspective. I think it's a healthy perspective rather than linking it traditional masculine value. Actually, that's the same move the social justice types will make towards conservatives, but in a kind way. So that this is normally done as a sort of weaponized way. They'll say things like, oh, you're salty tears, you're crying, oh, you fragile white man. Yeah. And essentially they're using traditional masculinity as an attack. They'll say, if you were a real man, you would take my shit and agree with me. And so what I just saw, that's the sort of shadow side of what you just did, which is the sort of framing of traditional masculinity as a way to solve or to heal some of these issues. And I actually see that weaponized in quite an unpleasant way. I mean, the sort of feminine empathy can be weaponized quite easily because you can see what hurts the other person if you can empathize with them. Yeah. So, and what hurts the conservative man would be being called a pussy, being called a wimp, being called a, right? And I think that,
and there's an interesting one thing you said in there suggests that second pathological response of submission. If you were, not this fragile white male, et cetera, you would agree with me. But that's not actually what's wanted or what's healing. It's not to it's to hear you, to really hear you without and feeling threatened by it. There is like this thing about white fragility. It's true. Like to be so fragile that you can't even hear somebody.
I don't know. I find that framing usually just a power move. Because if I say, if you don't agree with me, you're fragile. I mean, how do you get out of that? It's like you blocked all the exits, right? Like if I say, hey, Charles, if you don't agree with me on this point of view, you're fragile.
Right. And I don't care if you think I'm fragile. So that's the thing.
But it's a power move to say that the other person's psychologically pathological for not agreeing. Like that's this frame at the moment. It's so difficult. The exits feel blocked. It's like, how can you disagree and still be okay without these judgments of names?
Right. But that's an example of what I'm talking about. So if you get accused of being fragile, are you going to be fragile about being accused of being fragile?
I can laugh it off, but there's some days I just feel like, it's just such an unpleasant thing. Come on, be nice.
Right. But it's to return to what's really needed, which is presence.
And that is what's called for, because I have also seen when people get apologetic, I've seen this in the public space and just personally, actually the attacks get worse. Like if people kind of are too meek and back down, it's not healing. It's not
enough. And no amount of
submission enough. It's never enough because it's presence that's called for, not this capitulation.
Right. And I think that it does get so pathological that what's really needed then gets lost to the conservatives too, who are just in reaction to it. I mean, what is needed is for these stories to be heard. I think that if people can really hear what it is like to be you, then everything changes. If you can hear, what it's like to be, an African-American grandmother wondering if her children are going to come home because the police are out there and a teenager just got shot by one. Like, you don't have to accept necessarily like whatever political ideology that goes around it. But if you can take in that fear and understand what it's like to be that person, you will become more empathic.
Yes.
So
there's something on both sides, left and right, I think particularly in the States, but all over Europe and Brexit, everything else, of the cognitive ideology being the key position, the group identification being how people are viewed, whether it's, a racist or Islamophobe, or whether it's, someone saying, well, as a white man, you couldn't understand, rather than actually human empathy, rather than actually listening, the courage to listen to the story of, whether it's the black grandmother or the conservative farmer in Iowa, like that, actually, that's the piece that's missing there for me, rather than the cognitive, ideological name calling and putting in boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Charles, well, we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, any other areas before we wrap up that you want to touch upon? I mean, we've done food, money, masculinity. I think I'm going to call this one Food, Money, Men. That's a great title for the podcast. People will like that. But any other sort of major topics that are turning you on?
We've just been all over the map, so I don't want to open up a new one.
Maybe for just to sort of tease people and they can find it online. Like there's this story of disconnection is so wide that it's almost like you could come out with a course on anything and I would go, oh yeah, that makes sense,
Yeah, I mean, that's the overarching theme of what I'm doing is exploring different topics through the lens of a change in stories. And I find it's a very powerful lens.
Yes.
That kind of unifies a lot of seemingly disparate phenomena.
Yeah. And so there's these fundamental stories and they all have bodies, right? Whether it's the man isn't allowed to feel, that's a body. Whether it's this scarcity, so we have to get what we can from the world, or we have to control the world because it's dangerous. These are embodiments as well as cognitive stories, right? They're visceral stories.
Yeah, it's not just a story, actually. It's a state of being as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's an ontological piece. So it's a somatic piece to each of those stories.
Right.
Oh, I like talking to you, Charles. I feel kind of sad that this is wrapping up, but it's time to end.
All right.
Thank you so much. You're for listeners, they might want to catch Charles's other episode, which was recorded as part of the conference with my friend Adrian interviewing Charles. There's actually a couple on the podcast with Charles. And where can people find out more about your stuff? Where should they go?
Oh, charleseisenstein.org, I believe, is the
and that's EISENSTEIN.
Right.
Great. So charleseisenstein.org. Any other resources or things out there of yours that people should know about? There's all the courses and things on there that we talked about.
Yeah, everything's on there. Or you could, use the search engines on the interwebs and find things that way too.
Great. And a final parting message about the body for our listeners.
I guess maybe I would just say that to take a moment right now and feel the presence of what we've talked about in your body. That, again, this isn't just a cognitive exploration that we're doing, but every single thing that we've said probably created some kind of response in the body. And in this moment, you could probably feel the totality of all of those things. Some things may be triggering, some things make you angry, some things feel like I've been waiting for somebody to say this, things feeling, oh yeah, I've already thought of that, like all these different responses all together that form an experience. And to just take note of that experience residing inside of you and trusting that it will do its work over time.
Nice. Thank you, Charles. I appreciate that. And I really would invite listeners on any episode to take a little time to kind of notice the somatic impact and to digest. Often these conversations are very rich. And, for me, I listen to them back and I'll sit and digest it and be like, oh, what just happened there in the body? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodyfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.